Calvin Royce's voice cracked through the quiet like a rifle shot. "What the hell is my nanny doing teaching my son algebra?" The sound hit the marble library walls and bounced. 7-year-old Elliot froze mid-equation, the dry erase marker dangling in his small hand like a guilty secret. On the board, numbers hung half-finished: 2, 5, 11, 23, 47. Maya Williams turned slowly. Her dark curls were pulled into a neat bun, and the white collar of her uniform brushed the line of her jaw. She didn't flinch. She'd been spoken to like that before, by principals, parents, and men who confused power with rightness. She lowered the marker, her voice calm. "Elliot asked me a question, sir. I only helped him find his own answer." Calvin stepped into the room. His polished shoes struck the floor like punctuation marks, sharp, final, expensive. Behind him, Miss Fairchild, the official tutor, lingered near the bookshelf with her arms crossed, her posture all satisfaction and judgment. "This," Fairchild said icily, "is why household staff need boundaries. A nanny," her eyes flicked over Maya, "especially one without credentials, has no business teaching a child of Mr. Royce's standing." Elliot swallowed hard. "She wasn't teaching. She was just helping me." "Elliot," Calvin interrupted without raising his voice, "go to your room." "Dad!" "Now." The boy hesitated, eyes darting between them, then hurried down the hall. The echo of his footsteps faded until there was only the sound of rain whispering against the windows. Maya clasped her hands in front of her apron. "I didn't mean to cross a line. He asked about patterns." Calvin's gaze went to the board. The faint smudges of erased numbers, the arrows drawn between them. Logic, curiosity. Things that once mattered to him before he buried himself in profit margins and quarterly targets. "You're paid to care for him," he said flatly, "not to instruct him." Her throat tightened, but her voice stayed even. Sometimes caring and teaching are the same thing. Fairchild scoffed. "How poetic." She turned to Calvin. "If you allow this to continue, it will confuse the child. The nanny needs to remember her place." The slap of that sentence wasn't physical, but it landed. Maya stood still, the weight of silence pressing against her ribs. "My place," she said softly, "is wherever he needs someone to believe in him." Fairchild's mouth twisted. Calvin's jaw flexed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a curt gesture, he said, "Enough. Ms. Williams, you may leave." Maya inclined her head. "Yes, sir." She picked up the scattered markers, arranged them in perfect order, and walked out without haste. The back of her neck burned. Pride is heavy, she thought, but it's still better than shame. Outside the library, the mansion was hushed. The kind of silence that comes with wealth and isolation. She passed the wide staircase, the gleaming portraits, the smell of lemon oil. Everything perfect, everything cold. At the end of the corridor, Elliot sat curled on a bench beneath the window, knees to his chest. When he saw her, he straightened quickly. "Are you mad?" he asked. "Only at the weather," Maya said. "It's raining again." He didn't smile. "I got you in trouble." "No," she said. "Curiosity got me in trouble. And curiosity's always worth it." He tilted his head. So I was right. The number's double minus 1. She crouched beside him. You tell me. His brow furrowed. 2 times 2 minus 1. 5. 2 times 5 minus 1. 9. No, wait. 11. His grin returned. It works. That's math, she said softly. When you chase the question long enough, it gives up the answer. He leaned closer. Dad doesn't like when I ask too many questions. Then we'll ask them quietly, she whispered, pressing a finger to her lips. Questions are seeds. We'll plant them where they can grow. Elliot giggled, but it was a small, careful sound, like a bird testing the wind. That night, after tucking him into bed, Maya lingered in the doorway. His nightlight threw soft stars across the walls, a machine-made sky for a boy whose father was too busy to show him the real one. She remembered classrooms full of laughter, her chalk-stained hands, the smell of dry markers and potential. Then the meeting, the principal's voice. You people always make excuses for your kind of student. Her suspension, her license revoked, her silence purchased by paperwork. Maya turned off the light. Some scars don't show until the quiet. Downstairs, the mansion glowed with expensive solitude. Calvin Royce sat in his study, bourbon untouched, eyes fixed on the surveillance monitor. He told himself he only wanted to review what had happened. But when he pressed play, something shifted. On the screen, Maya knelt beside his son, not lecturing but listening, asking, smiling when he found the pattern. Elliot's laughter was unguarded, bright. The boy looked alive in a way Calvin hadn't seen in months. He paused the video. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. An empire builder who could read a market like scripture but couldn't read his own child. He exhaled through his nose and closed the laptop. The next morning, sunlight sliced through the blinds of Maya's small room at the far end of the mansion's east wing. She sat at the edge of the bed, lacing her shoes with slow precision. Her cheek still ached faintly from Fairchild's words more than from Calvin's glare. Words leave bruises too. Downstairs, she prepared breakfast, pancakes with blueberries, Elliot's favorite. She arranged the plate carefully, added a tiny powdered sugar star on top. When she brought it out, the boy was already at the table, swinging his legs. "Morning," she said. He grinned. "Morning, Miss Maya." Calvin entered a moment later. He looked at the pancakes, then at her. Something unspoken passed between them. Tension, apology. Maybe both. He cleared his throat. "Looks good." "It's his favorite," she said. Elliot beamed. "She makes math out of pancakes, see, Dad? 1 cut makes 2 halves, 2 cuts make 4. Eat before it gets cold," Calvin interrupted, but his tone had softened. Maya turned to leave, but Elliot called, "Wait! Miss Maya, tell Dad what you said, that math is like music." She hesitated. "Only that both have rhythm," she said quietly. "And sometimes, the wrong note leads you to the right song." Calvin looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Interesting way to put it. After breakfast, Elliot ran off to gather his school things. Calvin lingered, hands in pockets. "About yesterday," he said. "You were out of line." "Yes, sir." "But you were right." Maya blinked. "Sir?" He looked down at his coffee. "I watched the footage. My son was happy. I'd almost forgotten what that looked like. Maya said nothing. He went on, more quietly now. You taught once. I did. Why stop? I didn't, she said. I just stopped getting paid for it. A corner of his mouth twitched. Keep helping him. Quietly. Miss Fairchild doesn't need to know. Her eyes widened. Sir, he's learning from you. That matters. He hesitated. But keep it discreet. Yes, Mr. Royce. When she turned to leave, he said, almost to himself, You're not like the others. Maya smiled faintly. Neither is your son. That evening, she found a drawing slipped under her door. Crayon on notebook paper. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing beneath a whiteboard of stars. He'd written in shaky letters, Miss Maya helps me see numbers shine. She sat on the edge of her bed and let herself cry, quietly, like someone watering a plant in the dark. By the end of that week, the house learned a new rhythm that didn't announce itself with words. It was small things. The sound of a pencil scratching inside a kitchen notebook. The soft echo of shoe soles as the boy paced out a sequence along the hallway tiles. The pause at the turn of the stairs where sunlight cut a bright wedge, a place Elliot began to claim as his thinking spot. None of it needed permission. Curiosity made its own quiet corridors. Maya folded herself into this rhythm without show. She kept the visible part of her work immaculate. Menus checked, reminders pinned, laundry handled before it had time to wrinkle, and then threaded the unseen part through the day. A banana became fractions. The garden path mapped coordinates. The metronome ticked for 10 slow breaths whenever Elliot's chest got tight and the world felt like it was leaning. He learned to steady himself without announcing the storm. Calvin noticed because he was the kind of man who measured change by outcomes first and causes later. Elliot's mornings grew lighter. The school app began sending him small alerts he hadn't seen in months. On-time assignments. A teacher's note about persistence. A star next to participation. In the evenings, the boy lingered at the kitchen island after dinner, not to pick at dessert, but to open his journal and chase a question he hadn't finished. When Calvin passed the doorway, he didn't interrupt. He stood in the hall as if listening to a language he used to speak. Miss Fairchild noticed too, but not with gratitude. Control had been her certainty. Compliance, her proof the world stayed in its lane when properly supervised. She was a precise woman who believed progress traveled only on rails she laid. The sight of Elliot reading ahead in the workbook without prompting made her uneasy. The sight of a nanny's handwriting, small, patient annotations in the margin of a practice page, made her angry. She adjusted the schedule, lengthened drills, tightened rules. Elliot's shoulders tightened too, and so Maya loosened other things. The counterweight was never obvious. That was the point. On a rainy Tuesday, the school hosted a lower division brunch for parents and designated caretakers. Maya rarely attended such things. She knew the price of a room where wealth performed itself in small competitions. Whose child? Which tutor? What summer program? But the invitation bore her name in a careful serif, and Elliot tucked it into her pocket with a pride that made refusal feel like abandonment. She went. The auditorium smelled faintly of lemons and expensive coffee. Tables were dressed in white linen. There were composed flower arrangements, An art project displayed on easels. A slideshow loop without sound. Maya chose a seat along the wall. Not to disappear, just to give the anxious people a place to look when their need for hierarchy required it. Across the room, two mothers drifted toward each other, whispering behind bright smiles. A father in a navy suit watched Maya the way a person watches a fire exit. When the head of school spoke, the words were decorous and empty. Rigor, community, excellence. Syllables polished smooth by years of use. The subtext was less subtle. The speaker's eyes skipped past the staff table too quickly. The slide that flashed, "Partnering with families," dissolved before it finished loading. The room applauded the school's success and took a quiet inventory of who didn't belong to it. Maya knew this choreography and kept her shoulders square. She set a paper cup of coffee where it wouldn't stain linen, and she studied the student art instead. Elliot's piece hung low on the edge of the display, a paper collage of lily pads and a frog mid-leap. A faint graphite sketch of numbers tucked into the shadows. Not an accident, she thought. He was leaving himself a trail. Halfway through the program, a counselor spoke about math anxiety, using gentle phrases. Other parents nodded sympathetically. The counselor did not say the thing Maya had learned in a decade of classrooms. That anxiety slips in when a child is handed answers like receipts and never invited to smell the kitchen. Discovery leaves fingerprints. Without them, learning feels like theft. A woman in a silk blouse leaned over as the room emptied. She smiled without warmth. Her perfume was a boundary in a glass bottle. "You must be Ms. Williams," the woman said. "I've heard so much." People use "so much" when they know nothing and want you to fear what they know. Maya returned the smile with one built for saving face, not making friends. "I care for Elliot," she said. "He's a remarkable boy." The woman tilted her head. "My daughter had Miss Fairchild last year. Very effective, if you let her do her job." "She's consistent," Maya said. The answer left room for interpretation. The truth didn't need to cling to anyone's throat. On her way out, she stopped in the hallway where the school displayed photographs from past years. The frames marched backward in time. Truces, ceremonies, smiles behind glass. In one picture, an older teacher stood in front of a chalkboard that looked familiar down to the hairline crack at the corner. The caption named a school Maya knew by heart. She looked away before nostalgia could edit old pain into a gentler story. Weather held the day under its thumb. By afternoon, the city was a lot of wet reflections and hurrying. Calvin's office windows blurred into a gray panel he couldn't read. His calendar was full of the kind of meetings that made other men feel large. He canceled, too. Somewhere between earnings and legal, he opened a browser tab and searched her name again. The thread he'd found a few nights earlier had grown, former students adding notes. They used simple sentences and left specific memories like receipts. "She sat on the floor with us when we were scared. She brought oranges on test days. She taught us to draw triangles by listening first." He scrolled slowly, the way a person reads a eulogy. When he returned home early, the house felt like it inhaled. Staff went about their flow without glancing up. That was part of their professionalism and part of their self-preservation. He found Elliot in the mudroom, damp socks in a heap, hair wet, cheeks bright. The boy looked at his father and then passed him toward the hall, a reflex that did not belong to children of 7. He was looking for the person who made rooms less sharp. From the kitchen came a steady syncopation. Stir, pause, scrape, tap. Maya worked like someone who understood rituals as tools, not decorations. She had a towel thrown over one shoulder, and a foil packet of tea opened like a small book on the counter. Elliot hovered nearby, measuring cinnamon by smell, counting quietly under his breath. There was no performance for the returning patriarch. It was simply the day as it happened when nobody staged it. Calvin stayed in the doorway without announcing himself. He watched how the boy steadied himself against the counter, and how the nanny didn't rush to do the work for him. He watched the way she moved the kettle away just an inch, so the steam wouldn't catch a small hand. He watched the way she put the spoon down when Elliot wanted to try, and the way she picked it up when he drifted. No corrections, only adjustments. It looked like care, and it looked like teaching. And he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Miss Fairchild arrived at 4 sharp, punctuality pressed into every seam. The temperature in the room dropped a degree. She glanced at the teacups, at the journal left open on the table, and then at the child. When she said his name, it came out like an entry on a list. The hour that followed was efficient. Problems were assigned, time was split, scores were tallied in the tutor's head, without mercy or malice. Elliot completed 2 sheets correctly and 1 imperfectly. His shoulders drew up. He erased a neat hole in the paper, trying to tidy an error that didn't require apology. Fairchild pointed at a clock and at a metric. She was not wrong. She was merely insufficient. When the session ended, Elliot's composure held until the door clicked. Then the energy that had kept him upright broke its shape. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his fists clenched, a small boy trying to shrink out of a room that had plenty of space. Panic has a way of erasing square footage. Maya crossed to him without questions. She stood beside him at the stove where the kettle had begun to tremble. She turned off the flame and let the newly quiet room settle against his skin. She set one hand flat on the counter and mirrored her breath on purpose. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, until his ribs found the rhythm. The metronome on the shelf clicked. She didn't touch him until he leaned. When he did, it was only a shoulder, and it was enough. Calvin had not moved from the doorway. The scene arranged itself without him, which was a new sensation and not entirely unwelcome. He saw the panic release the boy's face a fraction at a time, a tide going out from hard sand. He understood suddenly how much of his parenting had been crisis response dressed up as strategy. He wondered whether steadiness might be learned the way any other skill is learned, in small daily practice, until muscle memory could find it. Later that night, when the mansion fell into its humming sleep, Maya sat on the floor of the staff locker room again, back against cool metal, notebook balanced on her knees. She recorded the day in the sparse language she trusted. Elliot held breath for 4 counts without instruction, chose to stay in the room, asked for tea instead of escape. Calvin watched without breaking the moment, sent an email canceling something at exactly 4:02, footman talk. Asked for a copy of the bedtime checklist and read it. Fairchild raised assignment rigor, effective with paper, less so with hearts. Keep the truce intact, even if it's only on paper. She paused and ran a thumb over the bent corner of a page where she kept a single photograph tucked like a talisman. It was not a relic of romance or family. It was a class picture, 15 kids in sweatshirts and braids and tooth gaps. She had circled 2 faces lightly in pencil, boys she had refused to let be measured only by their discipline records. Both had graduated. One had sent the infinity pendant years later with a note in print so careful it looked like stitching. Keep teaching. She closed the notebook before memory flooded the room and stole the oxygen. The anonymous notes did not stop. Another appeared under her door the next morning. Same paper, same ink, same precision. Do not confuse access with power. She slipped it into the back of her notebook and added one line beneath it in her even hand. Power is the thing you give a child when you teach them to trust their own mind. She didn't show the note to anyone. To bring it into daylight would make it larger than it deserved to be. The first real test arrived on a Saturday designed for display. Calvin's foundation hosted a small arts gala in the atrium. Glass, stone, catered benevolence. Staff were instructed to be visible but silent. Elliot was expected to make a brief appearance, shake hands that were too large for his, and then vanish upstairs with a tablet and a plate of petit fours. The boy put on the navy blazer that made him look like an advertisement for a school that bragged about classical languages. Maya prepared him the way you prepare a child for a storm you cannot outrun. She talked to him about exits and about anchoring himself to a single friendly detail. A painting he liked, the sound the fountain made, the smell of lemon in the polish. Names would wash over him. He could choose which to keep. He didn't have to be more than one person's child in a room full of patrons. The evening unfolded as these evenings do, with speeches and the gentle war of influence disguised as philanthropy. Calvin moved through it like water through pipes, efficient, necessary. Invisible if you didn't know how much depended on his path. He introduced Elliot briefly and stepped back. The boy held together for 5 minutes and then looked for the person who steadied him. He found her near a service door. Their eyes met for less than a second. It was enough to remind him he was not being graded for existence. A donor with a practiced manner drifted toward Maya, his smile trained and empty. He asked her how long she had been with the family and whether she found the demands of the job manageable. He said the word nanny as if it were a cocktail garnish. She answered with professional brevity, and when he pressed, she excused herself to refill a tray that did not need refilling. There are rooms where leaving is the highest form of self-respect. On the landing above the atrium hung a large abstract, blues and grays, and a single thin line of gold crossing the canvas at an improbable angle. Elliot stood in front of it for a long time, quiet amid the murmur. Maya joined him, not at his shoulder but at a distance that let him keep ownership of his noticing. The line of gold was not perfectly straight. It wavered in the middle where the painter had breathed. Elliot traced the wave with his eyes, and she saw the arithmetic in him relax into something like awe. She didn't say a word. Calvin, from the far side of the room, watched both of them, and understood at last why he had hired a nanny instead of another tutor when his assistant first proposed the staffing chart. He could have said it was for logistics or optics. It wasn't. He had hired a witness. He had hired someone to count what men like him always forgot to count. By the time the last guest left and the caterers reclaimed their trays, the house had slipped back into itself. The atrium echoed with the small sounds of dismantling. Elliot's blazer lay folded on a chair like a held breath. He drifted toward sleep without fight. Maya stood at the threshold of the boy's room for a moment longer than usual, listening to the steadying rhythm of a child who had survived a public evening without losing his private self. In his study, Calvin opened the laptop again, but not to look at markets or coverage of the gala. He wrote a single email to himself, with a subject line only he would understand. If care is instruction, budget for it. The body of the message was 2 bullets long. Insurance for staff development. Stipend for one unnamed employee to renew a teaching credential if she ever wanted to. He didn't send it to anyone. He saved it to drafts. Some decisions need a night to stop being gestures and become plans. Down the hall, in a small room with a narrow window, Maya slept with the infinity pendant warm against her skin. The house held its breath the way a body does when it begins to heal. Tentative, surprised, not yet willing to believe the change will hold. The storm had not passed. Miss Fairchild's certainty had not evaporated. The notes would likely keep sliding under a door now and then, but the patterns had shifted. In a library where numbers once hung like accusations, a frog kept jumping, one shy of the leaf and yet closer each time, because someone had made room for the leap. The first snow arrived quietly, softening the sharp edges of the Royce estate. The hedges turned white at their crowns. The driveway wound through a world of pale marble and whispering air. For once, the mansion looked gentler, as if the season itself had laid a blanket over its pride. Inside, warmth pulsed in waves. The hum of the boiler, the faint crackle from the library fireplace, the rhythmic shuffle of slippers across polished floors. Maya woke before dawn, as she always did. She liked the still hour between night and morning when the house held its breath. It was the time she claimed for herself, the single slice of life that didn't belong to anyone else. She brewed coffee in a chipped mug from home, the only thing in her room that didn't match the rest of the estate. Then she sat by the small window and wrote, same ritual as always. 1 page for reflection, 1 for hope. Her handwriting was even, precise, a habit learned from years of explaining logic to restless children. Elliot dreamed without fear last night, she wrote. He no longer whispers sorry in his sleep. Downstairs, the kitchen lights glowed. Elliot was already there, wearing an oversized sweater that belonged to his father, and a grin too big for morning. His small hands worked dough clumsily, pressing it into shapes that looked nothing like cookies but smelled like heaven. Maya watched for a moment before entering. She didn't correct him. She rarely did now. Correction had its place, but freedom had more power. He looked up, flour on his cheek. "You're late," he said, though the clock hadn't even reached 6. "Or maybe you're early," she answered. He shrugged, smiling. "It's a snow day. School's closed. I checked the website." He said it like a secret he'd earned. Maya nodded, hiding her amusement. "Then it seems the world has decided we need a break." She helped him clean the counter, folding dough into neat circles, pressing raisins into patterns. Elliot arranged them into equations only he understood. 5 on one side, 4 on the other, a missing piece in between. Math had become his language for safety. Each balanced sum meant the day might stay kind. By the time Calvin entered the kitchen, coffee steam floated between them like fog on a lake. He looked different in the mornings lately. Sleeves rolled, tie absent, that thin layer of armor businessmen wear still somewhere upstairs. He nodded a greeting, half distracted by his phone. Then he looked at his son, at the smudge of flour on his chin, at the calm brightness of the scene. For the first time in a while, he didn't rush. He put the phone face down on the counter and watched. Maya noticed. She didn't comment. A silence bloomed that wasn't awkward, just unfamiliar. A silence that asked no one to perform. Elliot held up a misshapen cookie. "Dad, it's supposed to be infinity." Calvin squinted, trying to see the symbol in the uneven twist of dough. "Looks like a pretzel that lost its way." Maya's lips curved. "Maybe infinity is supposed to look imperfect. Otherwise, we'd find the end too soon." He looked at her then, longer than necessary. Something in her tone, simple, without flattery, reminded him of how rarely people spoke to him like a man instead of a headline. For a second, he saw her not as an employee, but as someone who understood what was missing in his home, in himself. After breakfast, Elliot ran to the window, pressing his palms against the cold glass. The world outside was bright, endless, quiet. "Can we go out?" he asked. Maya turned to Calvin. "He hasn't had fresh air in days." The man hesitated. He had calls, meetings, 1,000 reasons to stay inside the glow of screens. But something in her steady gaze disarmed him. He exhaled. "Fine. 15 minutes. They ended up outside for nearly an hour. The snow came in soft spirals. Elliot darted through the yard, leaving crooked trails behind him. Maya walked slower, careful to let him lead. Calvin followed, his shoes sinking deep, the cold biting through his usual composure. At first he hung back, the observer again. But Elliot's laughter was contagious. It echoed off the stone walls, unrestrained and alive. For a man used to the quiet of power, the sound struck something buried under years of self-control. He picked up a handful of snow, tossed it once, caught it again like a coin he wasn't sure he wanted to spend. Elliot's first snowball hit him square in the shoulder. Maya froze, uncertain how he'd react. For a heartbeat, the air between them went still. Then Calvin did something no one expected. He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that cracks old habits in half. The second snowball flew straight at Maya, and within seconds, the three of them were in the middle of a war that had no sides, only joy. When it was over, they were breathless, cheeks flushed, and for once, there was no difference between billionaire and nanny, employer and employee. Only people trying to remember what warmth felt like in winter. Later, when Elliot napped by the fireplace, Maya gathered the scattered gloves and scarves. Calvin stood nearby, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold. His gaze lingered on his son. The boy's face, finally peaceful. No screen, no fear, no tutor correcting him. Just rest. "He's changing," Calvin said, not really to her, but into the air. "He talks more now, smiles. It's strange how I didn't notice when he stopped." Maya nodded. "Children don't stop all at once. They fade a little at a time. Silence grows quietly until you mistake it for peace." He looked at her again, sharply this time, as if the words had touched something too close. "You sound like someone who knows." "I do," she said simply. That night, when the house dimmed and the snow outside glowed faintly blue, Maya sat at her small desk, writing by lamplight. She listed the day's small victories: laughter, snow, stillness. She recorded Elliot's progress, his heartbeat steady, his shoulders loose. Then, almost against her will, she wrote another line. "Calvin Royce smiled without reason." She stopped, stared at it for a long moment, then underlined it twice. The following week brought tension back like an unwelcome visitor. Miss Fairchild returned from her short trip, stricter than before. Her lessons became drills again, mechanical and cold. Elliot's newfound ease began to shrink. The boy's eyes lost some of their sparkle, replaced by that guarded quiet Maya had seen too often in children forced to live for approval. One afternoon she found him sitting alone in the playroom, tracing circles on the floor with a pencil. The notebook beside him was empty. He didn't look up when she entered. She didn't speak right away. She had learned that comfort didn't always begin with words. She sat on the carpet across from him and waited. After a minute, he whispered, "She says I'm lazy because I think too much." Maya's hands tightened in her lap. "Thinking is not laziness," she said finally. "It's how you build the courage to know you're right, even when you're told you're wrong." He looked at her, eyes wide and unsure. "But Dad says Miss Fairchild is smart." "She is," Maya said. "But smart and right are not the same thing." Later that evening, Calvin called Maya into the sunroom. His expression was serious again, the familiar walls of authority rebuilt brick by brick. "Miss Fairchild told me Elliot's falling behind again," he said. "She says he's distracted, unfocused." Maya kept her tone steady. "He's not distracted. He's exploring. There's a difference." Calvin sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Exploring doesn't get him into the advanced program." "Maybe the advanced program doesn't deserve him," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment she thought she'd gone too far. But Calvin didn't snap back. He only looked at her with something almost like recognition, the kind you feel when someone names a truth you've been avoiding. "Do you always talk like that?" he asked finally. "Only when I mean it," she replied. That night, he didn't sleep. The snow outside reflected moonlight through his window, and for the first time in years he wondered if all his careful plans had been built on the wrong kind of brilliance, the kind that measures outcomes, but never hearts. In the small room at the far end of the east wing, Maya turned another page of her notebook. "Elliot is learning to question again," she wrote. "The house resists, but he grows anyway, like a plant through stone." She underlined the last sentence once, then set down her pen. The snow kept falling, steady and silent, covering the world in forgiveness. And somewhere inside that great, glittering house, a boy dreamed without fear. A father wrestled with the truth of love. And a woman who once lost her classroom kept teaching, softly, invisibly, as if the world could be rebuilt, one child at a time. By February, the snow had crusted into dull gray at the edges of the drives, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of thaw. The house had settled back into its hierarchy: Fairchild's punctual footsteps, the mechanical hum of the cleaner, Calvin's voice on distant calls, measured and remote. Beneath it all, a quieter current moved: Elliot's steady pulse of curiosity, the invisible thread between him and Maya that neither rules nor routine could quite sever. Each morning she rose before dawn, the house still breathing evenly in sleep. She liked to watch the light arrive by degrees, one window at a time, until the garden emerged from shadow. It reminded her of the classroom clock that used to tick through first period, students half awake, pencils scratching over paper. Those mornings had taught her that patience and repetition were cousins of grace. Elliot's progress was visible in small ways: the loosened line of his shoulders, the way he lingered over patterns instead of recoiling from them. He asked questions again, not just about numbers, but about everything. Why clouds move faster some days. Why his father never looked up when it rained. Why grown-ups used big words to hide small truths. Maya never dismissed his wonder. She let it roam, contained only by kindness. Miss Fairchild noticed. Her authority depended on measurable improvement, and Elliot's joy refused to be measured. She began keeping detailed reports, thinly veiled complaints dressed as professional concern. The first one reached Calvin's desk folded neatly in a file. The child exhibits dependency on household staff not assigned to academic instruction, it read. Boundaries between roles appear blurred. The sentences were crisp, polite, irrefutable in tone. They implied chaos without describing any. Calvin read the memo twice. The language irritated him not for its accusation but for its precision. Fairchild's words carried that sterile confidence he used in his own reports. For years he'd believed in tidy data, in control. Yet lately he caught himself listening for laughter instead of updates. The graphs on his office wall no longer impressed him as they once did. Numbers that described profits could not describe peace. He didn't respond to Fairchild's report. He tucked it beneath a stack of unread correspondence and stared at the ceiling until evening fell. That same night, the first tremor of scandal entered quietly through the servant's door. Maria, the housekeeper, found Maya in the laundry room folding linens and handed her a phone. "Someone posted about you," she said, uneasy. "On one of those community boards the rich people use?" Maya scrolled through the screen. A blurry photo taken during the foundation gala showed her beside Elliot near the abstract painting, his small face tilted toward hers. The caption was short, venom disguised as curiosity. Should staff be this close to their employers' children? Boundaries are important, even in progressive households. There were comments below, anonymous, indulgent, inappropriate, overstepping, typical. None said her name, but everyone knew. The digital rumor spread with the efficiency of privilege. She didn't answer, didn't forward, didn't defend. The screen dimmed in her hand. For a long time, she watched the reflection of the fluorescent light overlaid on the image, her own outline faint behind it. The world never tired of teaching certain people where their place was. By morning, whispers had reached the staff. Conversations paused when she entered. Politeness became fragile, something balanced on fingertips. Even Elliot sensed the shift. At breakfast, he ate without chatter, glancing between his father and Maya, trying to read what adults refused to say. Calvin noticed the silence too. He read the message threads that his assistant forwarded with clinical detachment, the same way he once read market forecasts. But beneath the practiced composure, something coiled. He'd built his empire on reputation. Gossip was a currency he understood. Yet this time, the target was not a competitor or a rival CEO. It was the woman who had given his son back his smile. At noon, he called Fairchild into his office. Her posture was impeccable, her satisfaction almost hidden. She claimed concern, not responsibility. "Children form attachments, Mr. Royce," she said smoothly. "It's natural. But such familiarity can lead to confusion about authority. I felt it my duty to ensure propriety." He listened without interruption. When she finished, he closed the folder in front of him and said only, "That will be all." His tone was even, but there was something final in it that made her hesitate before leaving. That evening, he canceled his dinner meeting and returned home early. From the foyer, he heard the faint sound of piano keys, hesitant, unpracticed. In the drawing room, Maya sat beside Elliot on the bench, her hands folded in her lap as the boy stumbled through a simple melody. The room was dim except for the lamp's warm halo around them. It looked like a painting of patience. When Elliot finished, Maya nodded once, not clapping, not praising, simply acknowledging the effort. The boy smiled in that quiet, satisfied way of his and slipped off to fetch a book. Only then did Calvin step into the light. She rose immediately, smoothing her apron. He noticed her restraint, the way she prepared herself for reprimand as if it were routine. "I heard about the post," he said. She didn't reply. "I've spoken to the necessary people. It will disappear by morning." Her brow furrowed. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." His voice softened. "You've done nothing wrong." For a moment, they stood facing each other across the polished floor, the air between them thick with the unspoken. Maya's eyes flicked toward the doorway where Elliot had vanished, then back to him. "The world believes what it's used to believing," she said quietly. "It's easier than changing the story." "Then we change it," he answered. But the words, though certain, carried the tremor of someone unused to defending what cannot be bought. The story did not change overnight. Rumors never dissolve completely, they fade, leaving residue like smoke on fabric. Maya went about her work as if nothing had happened, though her steps were quieter now. Fairchild, feeling her authority questioned, doubled her efforts. Her corrections became sharper, her tone colder. Elliot began to withdraw again, retreating into the safe spaces Maya built between lessons. Moments of baking, small riddles, talks under the staircase where sound didn't carry. Calvin watched the pattern unfold and felt the old machinery of his life grinding against a new, unfamiliar gear. He found himself less interested in meetings, more distracted by the clock near the library, its steady tick reminding him that some things moved even when you weren't watching. One afternoon, he dismissed Fairchild abruptly after she scolded Elliot for daydreaming. The woman left with tight lips and promises to send a report. He sat at his desk afterward, staring at the half-solved puzzle his son had abandoned. It was a riddle in geometric progression, something he couldn't parse. In the margin, in Elliot's careful block letters, was a small sentence. "Miss Maya says even mistakes have patterns." He closed the notebook gently, the way you close a wound that's beginning to heal. That night he called the kitchen after hours, asked Maya to bring tea to his study. She entered with the tray balanced steadily, the silver reflecting lamplight. He thanked her, and for a long while neither spoke. Papers covered the desk, financial statements, proposals, proof of a world that always demanded justification. In that silence, the ticking of the clock grew louder. "Do you ever miss teaching?" he asked finally, without looking up. "Every day," she said. "Why didn't you fight to go back?" "I did. Some battles don't make it into the paperwork." She placed the cup before him and turned to leave. He stopped her with a word. "Stay." It wasn't command but request. She hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite. He spoke again after a long pause. "When I was a boy, I used to think success would make things simple. But the more I built, the more complicated simple became. He looked up. You walk through this house like you already know what matters. I know what doesn't, she answered. The clock ticked. Outside, the snow began again, light as dust. They stayed there a while. Two people bound not by status, but by the quiet understanding of exhaustion. Neither named what was shifting between them. Some truths are fragile in their first form. Later, alone, Maya returned to her small room. She wrote by the dim bedside light, her words a map of survival. Elliot remained steady despite the noise. Mr. Royce stood against the current today. I think he surprised himself. The tutor's walls are cracking. The child will breathe again. She paused, pen hovering. Then she added one last line before closing the notebook. Sometimes, the powerful forget they're allowed to be kind. Down the hall, Calvin lingered at his window, watching snow fall into darkness. He thought of his son's laugh, of Maya's calm, of the word kindness, as something that required courage. The city lights flickered in the distance like small promises. He didn't know what he was building anymore, but for the first time in years he wanted to build it right. March came with restless wind and the smell of damp earth. The snow melted unevenly, revealing patches of brown grass and the bones of the garden beneath. Spring always uncovered what winter tried to hide. Inside the Royce estate, that same thaw began to reach the people who lived under its polished calm. The order that had governed everything, schedules, silences, hierarchies, no longer held its shape. Miss Fairchild returned from a week's absence with a new precision in her tone, as though absence itself had reminded her of her rank. She found Elliot in the library with Maya, the boy building a small bridge from books, each volume labeled with numbers that doubled with every step. See, he said, if I keep going, the bridge never ends. Fairchild's voice cut through the room like frost. It ends when I tell you to stop. That's what discipline means. Maya said nothing. She simply closed the nearest book and smoothed the dust from its cover. The gesture wasn't defiance, but it carried the quiet weight of dissent. Fairchild saw it and knew that in this house her control was slipping. By evening she had written another letter. It wasn't addressed to Calvin this time. It went to the Board of Governors at Glenwood Preparatory, to a parents' association that worshipped appearances, and to an online professional standards group that prided itself on policing behavior in wealthy homes. The letter's language was formal, polished, and full of implication. It spoke of unusual intimacy, blurred professional boundaries, and influence beyond station. There were no direct accusations, only the careful architecture of suspicion. Within 3 days, the story was everywhere. It started as a whisper among the city's elite, spread through social circles that disguised gossip as concern, and finally reached the press. The Nanny and the Heir, a lesson in overreach? Read one headline. Beneath it, a blurred photo. Calvin in his car. Maya walking beside Elliot with a backpack slung over her shoulder. Their laughter caught mid-motion. The article didn't need evidence. Its tone did the work. It described Calvin as a lonely industrial magnate, Maya as a former educator of uncertain record. It spoke of proximity, of risk, of propriety. It never mentioned the child at all. When the first call from his publicist came, Calvin was in the middle of a board meeting. He didn't answer. When the second came, he excused himself. He listened in silence while the voice on the other end explained how the narrative was spreading, how investors disliked distraction, how the foundation's sponsors were concerned about optics. The words ran together until they sounded like static. He hung up without promising anything. At home, the silence felt heavier than the headlines. Staff avoided eye contact. Maria spoke softly to Maya in hallways, her sympathy clumsy but sincere. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone to decide whether truth or comfort would rule it. Maya stayed at her post. She followed the schedule, ironed uniforms, helped with homework. But beneath her calm, something deeper stirred. The old ache of injustice, the familiar burn of being made suspect for doing something right. It reminded her of the day she was dismissed from the school system. The same polite phrasing, the same invisible wall between truth and narrative. Her hands shook only once, that night, when she folded Elliot's pajamas. She stopped, pressed her palms flat to the fabric, and breathed until steadiness returned. Elliot sensed the change even if no one told him. Children always do. He asked why reporters stood outside the gate, why his father looked so tired, why Miss Fairchild now avoided both of them. Maya didn't explain. She just told him stories about weather, how storms can be loud but temporary, how roots grow deeper when the sky turns against them. One evening, Calvin appeared in the kitchen long after dinner. He looked different. No tie, no armor. The weight of something invisible bending his shoulders. "They're asking me to make a statement," he said. Maya didn't turn from the sink. "You will." "They want me to distance myself," he continued. "To reassign you." She still didn't look at him. "Then you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be remembered as." He exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. "Do you ever doubt yourself?" "Every day," she said. "But not about him." She meant Elliot, and perhaps more than that. The next morning, the front page of the Glenwood Chronicle carried his answer. A photograph of Calvin at the gates, flanked by cameras, and a quote. "No one will be punished for caring for my son." The sentence was short, plain, deliberate. It was both a statement and a declaration of war. The fallout was immediate. The foundation board threatened to suspend him as chair. A longtime business partner hinted at temporary separation of interests. Social invitations dried up overnight. Yet beneath the noise, something unexpected happened. Ordinary people began to speak. Former employees, parents, teachers, those who had worked quietly in the background of power, flooded the newspaper's comment section with stories. They wrote about Maya, though most had never met her. About kindness and fairness and the small courage of those who act without permission. The narrative began to bend. Within the house, change was slower. Fairchild arrived one last time, face composed into professional neutrality. She handed Calvin a resignation letter and a thin smile. "It seems the environment here no longer values structure," she said. He thanked her for her service, nothing more. When she left, her heels clicked down the marble corridor like punctuation marks at the end of a chapter. In the weeks that followed, the noise outside the gates began to fade. The reporters found another story. The investors returned to counting numbers. The city's attention, fickle as weather, shifted elsewhere. But for Calvin, something fundamental had moved. The simple defense of his employee had exposed how shallow his old life had become. a structure built on obedience and fear of perception. He had spent years protecting an image that couldn't love him back. Maya noticed the quiet transformation. He lingered more often now, no longer pacing the halls like a man chased by deadlines. Sometimes she would find him standing at the doorway while she read to Elliot, silent, listening. The boy was thriving again. His confidence returned like green shoots through frost. Yet Maya felt no victory. She knew stories like this didn't end with applause. There were always traces of suspicion left behind, stains that polite words couldn't scrub. She had learned long ago that when a Black woman is vindicated, the world calls it luck instead of truth. But for Elliot's sake, she accepted the small peace that followed. One rainy evening, after Elliot had gone to bed, Calvin found her in the garden house, watering the plants she had coaxed through winter. He stood watching for a moment before speaking. "You could leave now," he said quietly. "You've earned that right." She looked up, surprised. "Why would I leave?" "Because people like me have ruined enough of your peace already." Maya rested the watering can. "Peace isn't given," she said. "It's grown, like these." She gestured to the small buds trembling under the lamplight. "They bloom where they can." He nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. The rain pattered on the glass above them. He thought of how far his world had shifted, from boardrooms to this quiet greenhouse, from strategy to silence. For the first time, he didn't feel diminished by it. When he left, she stood among the plants for a long while, listening to the rain. The air smelled of soil and new beginnings. Her hands, damp and cold, trembled not from fear, but from release. The fight was not over, but something inside her had already won. That night, in her notebook, she wrote only one line. "Truth is slower than gossip, but it lasts longer." Upstairs, Calvin lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, his son slept peacefully, the house breathing evenly again. He realized he no longer wanted to protect his reputation, only the small, steady world that existed now between the three of them. Outside, the last of the winter storm drifted east. By morning, the ground would begin to thaw for real. The frost had broken. Spring crept into the estate like a guest who wasn't sure they were welcome. The wind softened, the windows opened again, and the sound of birds returned to the mornings. The worst of the scandal had burned itself out, leaving behind only a faint scent of smoke, one that lingered in the hallways and the minds of those who had lived through it. The world outside had moved on, but inside the Royce household, something irreversible had shifted. Calvin no longer carried his phone everywhere. Meetings ended early, or didn't happen at all. His assistant had learned to stop asking why. In its place came a new ritual. Breakfast at the long wooden table, sunlight across the plates, Elliot's chatter filling the space where silence had once lived. Sometimes, Calvin caught himself smiling at nothing. The house staff noticed, and though no one said it aloud, they began to treat him differently, not with fear, but with the cautious respect one gives a man learning how to be human again. Maya moved through those mornings quietly. She didn't need to talk much. The rhythm of care, the pouring of juice, the tying of shoelaces, the soft hand on a child's shoulder, did all the speaking she needed. It was a peace she hadn't felt in years. Not safety exactly, but something close enough to remember what it was made of. Yet calm never lasts forever. It only pauses to catch its breath. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came in a plain white envelope, the kind used for utility bills, and might have gone unnoticed if Elliot hadn't been the one to bring in the mail. "This one's for you," he said, handing it to her before running off to fetch his backpack. Maya turned it over in her hands. The return address made her still. Lincoln Middle School. She had not seen the name written in years. The sight alone carried a dozen ghosts. Inside, a single page. A formal letter from the new principal, inviting her to return as a teacher. The district had reviewed her record, it said. Old allegations had been cleared, her certification reinstated. They wanted her back, not as an assistant, not as a substitute, but as head of the mathematics department. "Your students still talk about you," the letter concluded. "We could use that kind of heart again." She read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her apron pocket. Her hands trembled for only a moment. That evening, she stood at the edge of the garden watching the sky bruise into violet. The air smelled of damp soil and new grass. Elliot's laughter floated through an open window somewhere above, followed by the faint thud of a basketball hitting carpet, too soft to do damage, but enough to make her smile. She should have felt joy. Instead, a quiet ache pressed behind her ribs. The letter wasn't just an offer, it was a door. But doors, she knew, didn't open without something being left behind. At dinner, Calvin noticed her distraction. She ate slowly, her gaze somewhere else, her hands turning her napkin into a small folded shape. He didn't ask then. He had learned that some truths prefer to speak after the dishes are cleared. Later, when the house quieted and Elliot's light went dark, he found her in the kitchen rinsing a pot that was already clean. "You're somewhere far away," he said. She hesitated before answering. "They offered me a position," she said finally. "At Lincoln. Teaching again." He leaned against the counter, processing the words. "You wanted this," he said, not as a question. "You've earned it." "I did," she said softly. "Once." He understood the hesitation immediately. It was the same uncertainty he'd felt when he realized his empire no longer satisfied him. Success, when it comes too late, can feel like a stranger. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know." She dried her hands, turning the towel over between her fingers. "Teaching was my first home. But Elliot..." She stopped there. "He'll miss you," Calvin said. "So will I." The honesty in his voice startled them both. He looked away first, breaking the moment before it could become confession. "But you can't stay here forever," he added, more gently. "No one should live in someone else's story." That night, she couldn't sleep. The letter lay on her bedside table, its edges curled slightly from the heat of the lamp. She imagined her old classroom, rows of desks, chalk dust in the air, the smell of pencil shavings in adolescence. But when she tried to picture herself there, her hands reached for a smaller one, a child's hand, Elliot's hand. In her notebook she wrote, "Freedom is not always where you left it." Days passed. She didn't mention the offer again, though Calvin knew the silence between them carried it like a third presence in every room. Elliot sensed it too, in the way adults pause before answering each other. One afternoon he asked bluntly, "Are you leaving?" Maya didn't lie. "Maybe," she said. "Sometimes, when people love something, they have to go build more of it." He frowned, trying to understand. "But who will teach me then?" "You'll keep learning," she said. "That's what real teaching does. It keeps going, even when the person is gone. He nodded slowly, but his eyes clouded with the kind of sadness that doesn't know how to fit into words. A week later, Calvin called her into his study. Papers covered the desk, none of them business-related. The draft email she didn't know he'd written weeks before about funding staff education still waited unsent on his laptop. He gestured toward the chair. "Sit," he said. His tone wasn't command anymore. "I've been thinking," he began. "If you decide to take that job, I can arrange housing near the school. The foundation has property there, and a car if you'll need it." "You don't have to—" "I know," he interrupted. "I want to." It was the closest thing to gratitude he'd ever managed to say. She looked at him for a long moment. His hair had started to gray at the edges, the first honest sign of time she'd seen on him. Power had softened in him somehow, not vanished, but changed shape. She realized she respected him more for it. "I haven't decided yet," she said quietly. He nodded. "Take your time. Just know that whatever you choose, I'll make sure you're not punished for choosing it." When she left the room, the late sunlight caught the edge of the letter still tucked in her pocket. It glowed like something alive. That night, she dreamed of her old students. She saw their faces, older now, sitting in a classroom without her. They laughed, argued, grew. But at the back of the room stood a smaller figure, Elliot, looking lost among the crowd. When she woke, the pillow was damp. By morning, her decision still hadn't formed words. She went about the day as usual, breakfast, reading, errands. But while she helped Elliot with his math notebook, she caught him correcting himself mid-problem, smiling when he found the pattern. He didn't look up for approval. He didn't need it. The sight brought a warmth so deep it hurt. Later, she went to her room, took out the letter, and unfolded it one last time. She ran her finger over the line that said, "We could use that kind of heart again." Then she tore the letter in half, neatly, without hesitation, and placed the pieces in the wastebasket. Outside, the garden trembled in the wind. She would not go back to the classroom. She was already teaching, right here, in ways no system could measure. When she stepped out into the hall, Calvin was waiting. He didn't ask for her answer. He must have seen it in her face. He only said, "Then we start from here." And she nodded, feeling both the weight and the lightness of what she'd chosen. For the first time in years, she wasn't returning to anything. She was moving forward. That night, in her notebook, she wrote, "I stayed, not because I had to, because sometimes the lesson is still being written, and the student isn't done learning." In the room across the hall, a boy dreamed beneath a soft lamp glow, numbers and stars swirling through his imagination. And somewhere between them, the fragile piece of a rebuilt life held firm, quiet, steady, alive. Years slipped past without announcement, the way seasons change inside a rhythm rather than a date. The Royce estate, once sharp and silent, had softened into something human. Laughter could be heard from the kitchen some mornings, the sound of a boy's sneakers thudding against marble, the echo of a man who no longer spoke in orders. Elliot grew tall faster than anyone expected. The roundness of childhood gave way to the awkward grace of adolescence. Elbows too long, voice uneven, mind racing ahead of his body. He still called Maya Miss out of habit, though she had long stopped being his nanny in any practical sense. Now she was something else. Mentor. Family. The quiet center of the house's orbit. Calvin changed too. His empire still stood, but he no longer worshipped it. He worked fewer hours, read more, listened better. When he looked at his son, he saw not inheritance but continuation. A life untethered from the mistakes that had shaped his own. He and Maya never spoke of the scandal again. It had faded like a scar that only ached in cold weather. But time always collects its dues. It began with fatigue, Calvin's habit of sitting longer at breakfast, the tremor in his hands when he reached for the coffee mug. He brushed it off as age. Then came the coughing, dry and persistent, echoing in the library at night. Maria mentioned it quietly to Maya, who noticed the weight he'd lost, the way his suits hung loose around the shoulders. One evening she found him alone in the study, the light from the desk lamp catching the hollow beneath his eyes. Papers were scattered before him, but his gaze wasn't on them. He looked up when she entered, trying to straighten as if embarrassment were heavier than illness. "You should be resting," she said. "I will," he answered, though both knew it was untrue. He tried to keep it hidden. Old instincts die hard, and Calvin Royce had spent decades pretending strength. But secrets can't live long in a house full of care. Within weeks, the truth came from a doctor's mouth: lymphoma, early but insistent. The words landed like winter returning too soon. Maya didn't cry, not then. She simply listened, nodding at the clinical details, the treatment schedule, the probabilities. She had lived long enough to know that pain demanded witnesses, not speeches. Elliot learned last. Calvin sat with him in the garden, under the skeletal branches of trees that hadn't yet bloomed. The boy was 15 now, all height and uncertainty. He tried to be brave the way children think bravery works, by refusing to blink. Maya watched from the terrace, unseen. The boy's knuckles whitened on the bench edge, his father's words sinking in piece by piece. When it was over, Calvin reached for his shoulder, but Elliot was already standing. He walked into the house without looking back. That night, he locked himself in his room. Maya didn't knock. She waited until the light under the door went out, then sat outside with her notebook. She wrote a single line. "Grief enters quietly and rearranges the furniture." The next morning, she found him in the library, the same place where years ago he had learned to find patterns in numbers. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he was focused, writing equations on the whiteboard. She stepped closer and realized it wasn't math. It was a list. Chemotherapy, remission rate, stem cells. Facts lined up like soldiers. He turned when he heard her. "If we know the numbers, we can beat it," he said. "We just need to stay ahead of the pattern." Maya's chest tightened. She saw herself in him. The same desperate faith in logic, the same refusal to surrender. She touched the marker in his hand gently. "Sometimes patterns aren't for solving," she said. "Sometimes they're for understanding." He looked away, jaw trembling. "I can't just wait." "You won't," she said. "You'll stand beside him. That's harder than waiting." The weeks that followed blurred into a routine of hospital visits and quiet returns. Calvin faced treatment with the same discipline he once gave to business deals. He read about his condition obsessively, asking doctors questions in a tone that bordered on interrogation. Yet under that armor, he was frightened. Not of death, but of leaving things unfinished. Maya handled the household. She spoke with nurses, arranged schedules, shielded Elliot from the worst of it. But she couldn't shield him from everything. The boy spent hours researching, calculating, scribbling possible outcomes. At night, he left notes on his father's desk, small equations, hopeful metaphors. Recovery equals rest plus courage. Health is the limit as fear approaches zero. Calvin would find them in the mornings and smile, tired but genuine. One afternoon, during a rare moment of energy, Calvin asked Maya to join him on the terrace. The air smelled of rain. He wore a blanket over his shoulders, his hands thin against the fabric. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think power was the ability to make people move. Lately, I've learned it's the ability to let them stay." She said nothing. The wind carried the scent of lilacs beginning to bloom. "If I don't make it," he began, then stopped, rephrasing the sentence like an equation. "When the time comes that I'm not here, promise me you'll keep him steady. He listens to you in ways he never will to anyone else." She shook her head. "He doesn't need me forever. You've already made him strong." Calvin smiled faintly. "You give me too much credit." "I don't," she said. "You stayed. That was enough." When treatment ended months later, the doctors spoke of cautious optimism. The cancer had retreated but not disappeared. Calvin returned home thinner, slower, but alive. The house adjusted around him. Routines became gentler. Meetings gave way to long afternoons with books, to shared tea, to the quiet rhythm of 3 lives breathing in the same space. Elliot changed, too. His teenage rebellion never came in shouts. It came in purpose. He began volunteering at a local clinic, helping organize supplies, asking questions about medicine, statistics, healing. Maya watched him and saw the echo of every lesson she had ever whispered. One evening she found him sitting at the piano, fingers resting on the keys without pressing. "He's getting better," he said softly. "I can tell." "You can hope," she answered. "That's what faith looks like when it's honest." He nodded. "You think he knows how much I love him?" Maya smiled. "He does. You showed him. Every time you asked another question." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she opened her notebook again. The pages were crowded now, years of small handwriting marching like footprints across time. She added a final note for the day. "The boy is becoming the teacher. The man is learning how to rest. And perhaps I have finally learned how to stay still without fear." Outside, the moon hung over the garden like a watchful eye. The house, once a fortress of control, breathed like a living thing. In one room, a father slept, fragile but unafraid. In another, a boy dreamed of equations and healing. And in her small corner under the slanted roof, Maya listened to the night settle, her heart steady with a quiet certainty. Every lesson she had ever given had led to this moment, where love itself had become the answer. Autumn returned with that strange clarity it always carried, the world glowing while everything quietly died. The garden, once riotous with color, dulled into rust and gold. The air carried both sweetness and warning. Maya felt it before anyone said it aloud. The change in Calvin's breath, the way his cough came back sharper, shorter, more deliberate. His body moved slower again. He hid it from Elliot as long as he could, but a house built on truth cannot disguise sorrow forever. It began with a single fainting spell. He had been standing in the study trying to reach for a file when his legs simply gave way. Maya was the one who found him. For a moment, her mind snapped into the old clarity of emergency. Voice steady, breath measured, pulse counted, blanket fetched. When his eyes opened again, he smiled faintly, embarrassed. "Just the room spinning," he murmured. But she knew. Doctors returned, voices polite but grim. The cancer had spread. Not wildly, not yet, but insistently, as if the reprieve they'd been granted was now expiring. There were options, they said. More treatment, more waiting, more pain disguised as hope. Calvin listened with the patience of a man who had already made his peace with limits. Maya sat beside him, fingers tight around a cup of untouched tea, every heartbeat echoing the same thought. Not yet. Elliot found out 2 days later. He was 17 now, tall and sharp around the edges, carrying both youth's defiance and something older, the quiet watchfulness he'd learned from her. He didn't react the way she expected. No outburst, no denial, just silence. Then motion. He began reading, researching again, his notebooks filling with data and questions. At night she would find him in the study, eyes rimmed red, surrounded by open pages. He had inherited his father's need to fix things and her refusal to surrender. One night, long after midnight, she entered the library and found him awake, the glow from the desk lamp painting his face in tired gold. Charts covered the table, survival rates, case studies, experimental therapies. His pen moved fast, angry. "They're giving up too soon," he muttered. She didn't stop him. She remembered the same anger in herself years ago, when she'd lost her brother. It was the same helplessness disguised as purpose. She sat across from him quietly until he looked up, frustrated. "You taught me to look for patterns," he said. "There has to be one here, something they missed." "There's always a pattern," she said softly. "But not all of them are meant to be broken." He stared at her, jaw trembling. "Then what's the point?" "The point," she said, "is what you do while it's breaking." He turned away, blinking fast. "I can't just watch him fade." "Then don't," she said. "Watch him live." From that night on, Elliot changed. He stopped fighting the illness like an enemy and started treating it like weather. Something you endure, prepare for, and walk through together. He spent hours by his father's side, reading aloud when Calvin's voice grew weak, cooking breakfast even when it burned, bringing sunlight into the room just to see how it fell on his father's face. He didn't say the word love often, but he lived it in every gesture. Maya watched it unfold in quiet awe. Every lesson she had ever given him was there. Patience, compassion, courage that looked nothing like pride. The boy who once hid behind logic now met life head-on, no longer afraid to feel its weight. Calvin noticed, too. In his illness, he had time to observe what health had made him miss. Elliot's laughter carried through the halls, steady and calm. Sometimes, when Maya entered the room, Calvin would look at her with that weary gratitude that doesn't need language. "He's you," he said once, voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "He's his own," she answered. But deep down, she knew what he meant. As the weeks passed, the sickness deepened. Calvin spent most of his time in bed, too weak to walk the stairs. The house changed its rhythm around him. Meetings were canceled, calls unanswered. Life condensed to the soft beat of heart monitors and the rustle of curtains. Maria moved through rooms like a ghost, always in tears. The world outside went on. Cars, markets, gossip. But inside, everything existed in slow motion. Elliot never left his side. He learned to measure medicine, to track symptoms, to listen for the subtle shifts in breathing that signaled exhaustion. The doctors praised his composure. Maya recognized it for what it was. Love disguised as discipline. One cold afternoon, the three of them sat in the sunroom. The light was thin, the color of faded gold. Calvin dozed, his face turned toward the window. Elliot was sketching quietly, pencil moving over the page. Maya watched, curious. When he finished, he turned the paper toward her. A portrait of his father, delicate and precise, each line drawn with reverence. "It's how I want to remember him," he said. "Not sick, just thinking." Her throat tightened. She reached out, smoothing a curl of hair from his forehead. "He'll live longer in you than he ever could in time," she said. When evening came, Calvin stirred, asking faintly for water. His voice was brittle but calm. He reached for Elliot's hand. "You'll be fine," he murmured. "You both will." His eyes flicked to Maya, and for the first time she saw fear there, not of death, but of leaving love unfinished. She took his other hand. "We'll take care of each other," she said. He smiled at that, faintly. "You already do." That night, the fever came. It moved through him quickly, burning the room into a haze of warmth and whispers. Doctors were called, nurses arrived, medication administered. The air thickened with urgency. Elliot stood in the corner, trembling but focused, counting breaths, recalling everything Maya had ever taught him. How to stay steady, how to breathe for someone else when they cannot. Hours blurred. The fever broke near dawn. Calvin's breathing steadied but shallowed, his pulse a thin rhythm against Maya's wrist. Elliot sat beside him, exhaustion painting his face in pale colors. He reached for his father's hand again. "I'm here," he said quietly. "You don't have to worry." Calvin's eyes opened, and for a moment he looked young again, the man he had once been before the world hardened him. He nodded weakly, his gaze drifting to Maya, then back to his son. "You did well," he whispered. Then he slept. The days that followed existed in fragments, soft beeps, muted conversations, the scent of antiseptic and lilies. Maya moved through them as if under water, holding the pieces together with quiet purpose. Elliot hardly left his father's side. He handled doctors' questions with a calm that startled even them. When one of the nurses complimented him, he shrugged. "I had good teachers." One night, when the house was silent, Maya passed the library and found him there, sitting at the same desk where he'd once drawn equations as a boy. Papers surrounded him again, but these weren't calculations. They were notes, paragraphs, words. At the top of the page, a title, "The Pattern of Care." He looked up when she entered. "It's for him," he said. "And for you. I want to study medicine, not because of the sickness, because of what it showed me." She didn't speak. She crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. Pride, grief, love, all of it tangled together in her chest. She realized then that he had already become what she hoped for, a man who saw beyond himself. When she returned to her room that night, she opened her notebook and wrote, slowly, carefully, as if the page itself were fragile. The child has become the teacher. The pattern continues. The house is full of light even in its quietest hour. Down the hall, Elliot sat by his father's bed, holding his hand. Outside, the first frost of winter silvered the grass. Inside, warmth lingered. A glow not from the lamps, but from the living proof that lessons, once given with love, never die. The last winter came softly, almost politely, as though the world had decided that Calvin Royce had endured enough storms. The snow fell without wind, blanketing the garden in perfect white. Inside the house, everything slowed to the rhythm of breathing. Deep, shallow, deep again. The doctors had stopped speaking in hopeful terms. Their visits became shorter, their instructions simpler. There was nothing left to fight, only the long act of letting go. Maya knew the shape of that silence. She had seen it once before, in the narrow hospital room where her brother had taken his final breath years ago. It had the same stillness, the same deceptive calm. Only this time, she refused to look away. Calvin spent most of his days in the sunroom now, where he could see the garden. The nurses came and went like ghosts, careful not to disturb the quiet. Elliot sat near him almost constantly, reading aloud from books his father had loved when strength still came easily. Steinbeck, Baldwin, even the business essays that once kept him awake long into the night. The boy's voice had deepened. It filled the room with something steady and alive. Maya watched from the corner, rarely speaking. She brewed tea, adjusted blankets, tended to the small tasks that dignity demands. Yet there was reverence in every motion, as if each gesture was a prayer she didn't have to say aloud. Sometimes, when Calvin was awake enough, they would sit together without words, letting the ticking of the clock speak for them. He would glance toward her and nod, a faint smile acknowledging everything that didn't need naming, the years of loyalty, the grace that had reshaped his life. One afternoon, while Elliot had gone to fetch medicine, Calvin motioned for her to come closer. His hand trembled as it reached for the table drawer. From inside he drew out a sealed envelope, his name written neatly across the front. "For him," he whispered, "when it's time." She took it silently, pressing it against her heart. He looked at her a long moment, his breathing uneven but calm. "You kept us alive," he said. The words barely formed, but their weight filled the room. She wanted to protest, to tell him he had saved himself, but she only nodded. Some truths are too heavy to carry in words. That night, the sky turned the color of steel. Elliot slept in the chair beside the bed, his head resting near his father's arm. The monitors hummed in low, rhythmic tones. Maya sat awake, a sentinel in the half-light, counting each breath without meaning to. Around midnight, Calvin stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he seemed clearer than he had in weeks. "Is it morning?" he asked softly. "Not yet," she said, "but it will be soon." He smiled faintly. "It always is." His gaze shifted to the window, where the snow was still falling, slow, patient, infinite. "Tell him," he murmured. "He did enough." His fingers relaxed against the blanket. The air between them stilled, stretched, and then broke into silence. The machine beside him went flat. Maya stood without a sound. She placed her hand gently over his, the warmth already fading beneath her skin. She didn't cry. Not then. She closed his eyes, whispered a prayer too quiet for words, and turned off the light. Elliot woke moments later, the kind of waking that comes from knowing before seeing. He looked at his father's stillness, then at her. Their eyes met, and in that shared understanding, something both shattered and healed. They didn't call the nurses right away. They sat together in the soft dark, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life completed. Outside, the garden glittered under moonlight. It seemed cruelly beautiful, the way the world carries on while hearts stop. By dawn, the house had filled with footsteps and whispers, the subdued order of people doing what needed to be done. Reporters would come later, no doubt. Statements would be written. The empire would pass to lawyers and accountants. But for now, it was just the two of them and the echo of his last breath. After the body was taken, Maya found Elliot in the library. He sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the blank whiteboard where years ago his father had caught them, breaking boundaries. On the ledge lay the same marker, dry with age. He picked it up, uncapped it, and began to write. Not equations this time, but words. He taught me to listen. He taught me to stay. He taught me to try again. Maya watched from the doorway. He looked older than his years, but steady. His grief precise, almost mathematical. When she handed him the envelope, he didn't open it immediately. He sat for a long while, fingers tracing the edges as though feeling for his father's pulse through paper. Finally, he tore it open. Inside was a single page written in Calvin's unmistakable hand. Elliot, by the time you read this, I hope you already know that life is not about winning, but about building something that can stand when you're gone. You are already that something. Take care of the world that took care of me when I stopped deserving it. And take care of her, the one who taught us both how to see. Dad. The paper trembled in his hands. He looked at Maya, eyes bright but dry. He meant you, he said. She smiled, the kind of smile that comes from the deepest sorrow, small, steady, true. He meant us, she replied. The funeral came 3 days later. Snow had melted, leaving the ground damp and raw. The service was private. No cameras, no journalists, only a few close friends and the people who had known him beyond his wealth. Elliot spoke briefly, his voice calm and clear. He talked about his father's laugh, about learning patience, about the way people can change if given the chance. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, though Maya's cheeks stayed untouched. Her grief lived quieter, deep in the bones. After the last guest left, she remained by the grave long after dusk. The earth was still fresh, the air cold against her skin. She thought of every life she'd entered and left, every child she'd taught, every moment she'd stayed silent so others could find their voice. Rest, she whispered, laying her palm against the new soil. We'll keep the light on. Back at the house, Elliot sat at the piano. The notes he played were hesitant at first, then sure. The melody simple but pure. Maya listened from the hallway, eyes closed, heart heavy but full. The music filled the house the way laughter once had, rising through the rooms like forgiveness. Later, in her room, she opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote without pausing. He left, but not empty. The boy stands where the man once did, steady in the wind. The house breathes again. Maybe that's what grace is, what remains when the noise ends. She closed the book, turned off the light, and sat by the window watching the night settle. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel responsible for holding the world together. It would stand on its own now, in Elliot, in the lessons sown like seeds, in the quiet proof that love, once planted, outlives even its giver. Outside, snow began again, faint and slow, erasing footprints from the path to the garden. Tomorrow there would be sunlight. Years rolled over the estate like quiet waves on a patient shore. The world outside moved on. New markets, new inventions, new wars of ambition. But inside, time had reshaped itself into gentler patterns. The Royce name still held its weight in the city, now printed beside new foundations and scholarships rather than acquisitions. The house, rebuilt and renamed in the papers, had become something simpler. A home, lived in by fewer people, but filled with more life. Elliot Royce was no longer the quiet boy who hid behind numbers. At 25, he carried himself with a stillness that came from having already walked through storms most men never meet. His hair had darkened. His eyes held that steady, searching look Maya had seen once in his father's, only now tempered by empathy. He had finished medical school against the advice of half the business world, and in spite of every article that called it a billionaire's distraction. He worked at County General, the same hospital where Maya once waited in corridors for news that never came. The house was quieter now. He visited rarely, only on weekends when exhaustion demanded silence, and the city noise felt too sharp. Maya still lived there, in her small room at the East Wing, though she could have left long ago. Calvin's will had given her the means to retire comfortably, but leaving had never been about money. She stayed because the place had become a kind of living history, and because some walls remember kindness better than people do. When Elliot returned one cold evening in December, the light in her window was still on, just as it had been when he was a boy. He paused outside the door, snow clinging to his coat, the smell of winter following him in. He knocked softly. "Come in," her voice called, still warm, still strong, touched now with the faint tremor of age. She sat by the same small desk, her hands folded over a worn notebook. Her hair was silver at the temples. Her smile, when she saw him, was exactly as he remembered. Not wide, not theatrical, just the kind that made the air settle. "You look tired," she said. "I am," he answered honestly, "but it's the good kind." He took the chair across from her, glancing at the walls. She'd kept them simple. No photos, only books, and one framed picture of the garden in spring. For a long while they didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. They had always understood silence better than most. Finally, he placed a small envelope on the desk. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping, Dr. Elliot Royce, recipient of the National Medical Ethics Award. Beneath the headline was a photograph of him, shaking hands with a young patient, both smiling. Maya's eyes softened. "You kept your promise," she said. "I did more than that," he replied. "I kept learning." He told her about the clinic he'd opened downtown, one that took anyone, regardless of background or insurance. He told her how he'd built the program in his father's name, though quietly, without ceremony. "It's called the Pattern Foundation," he said. "You once told me patterns aren't just math. They're how love repeats itself. I thought it was time to prove you right." Her laugh was quiet, almost like a sigh. "You always did make better use of my lessons than I did." He leaned forward. "No, you lived them. I'm just catching up." There was pride in her face, the kind that doesn't shine but glows. She studied him as though memorizing this version of him, the grown man who still carried a child's honesty somewhere behind his eyes. "You've become your own teacher," she said at last. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I think I just found the courage to follow one." They sat in companionable silence again. Outside, the snow was falling hard, blanketing the windows with soft white. Elliot glanced at her hands, still resting on that notebook. "Do you still write in it?" "Every day," she said. "It keeps the world steady. Some days I write about you, some days about the garden, some days about nothing at all. But I always write." He smiled. "You'll have to let me read it someday." "Maybe," she said, eyes twinkling. "When I'm gone, and you need reminding that you were loved properly." He looked at her for a long time, then reached into his coat and pulled out another envelope. Inside was a document, foundation papers, signed and sealed. "It's yours too," he said. "Not by name, but by spirit. The Pattern Foundation isn't about medicine or money. It's about continuing what you started, teaching people how to care. You're already the first chapter." She tried to speak, but her throat caught. She looked down, blinking fast. "You always were good with patterns," she whispered. He stood, placing a hand over hers. "You showed me what to look for." They sat like that for a while, the world outside wrapped in snow and silence. Time seemed to fold in on itself. The woman who had once knelt beside a boy in a library, now sitting beside a man who had found his purpose. When he finally rose to leave, she walked him to the door. The air outside was sharp, the sky heavy with stars. He turned at the steps, his breath clouding in the cold. "Miss Maya," he said softly, "you remember what you told me when I was small? That questions are seeds?" She nodded. "They grew," he said simply. "Every one of them." Then he was gone, his car disappearing down the long, snow-lined drive. Maya stood for a long time on the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The cold bit her cheeks, but she didn't move. Somewhere in the distance a bell struck midnight, and she felt the echo deep inside. Not of grief, but of completion. Later, in her room, she opened her notebook for what might have been the 1,000th time. The pages were nearly full. She turned to the last one and wrote slowly, her hand steady despite the tremor of age. "The boy became the man became the light. The pattern held. I have done my work. The rest belongs to them." She closed the notebook gently, set it on the desk, and looked toward the window. The snow had stopped, the sky was clear again, and the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Soft gold over the world she had helped to heal. In the quiet, the house breathed once more. It had changed owners, changed seasons, changed fates, yet somehow remained what she and that small boy had once made of it. A place where learning meant love, and love meant staying until the lesson was done. And outside, beneath the morning light, the garden began to wake. New green pushing through the frost. The promise of another beginning written everywhere, repeating itself in perfect, endless pattern.